I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your efforts to mitigate this risk, frankly. I mean, you're currently leading the International Science Report on the Safety of Advanced AI, which I kind of understand is something like an IPCC,
Yes.
International Panel for Climate Change, for AI and for AI risk and specifically or safety. But it seems to me that unlike climate change, there isn't scientific consensus here. I mean, in some ways, the IPC challenge is easier because we have a whole research community that seems divided on whether there's even risk at all.
Yes.
So how do we get to that scientific consensus?
The answer is simple. The consensus is basically to acknowledge the lack of consensus. Okay, so we should all like rationally agree that some people think it's going to be very dangerous, and some people think it's going to be fine, and some people think it's going to be a short term, and some people think it's going to be long term, and there's a whole range of these views in timeline and amplitude of the risk. And I think that is the scientific truth that we don't know, and this is the span of possibilities that are plausible if you ask experts. But from the point of view of public policy, that means dealing with the plausible worst case risks. So even if we're not sure, like if somebody says, oh, there's, some scientists think that this asteroid is going to hit the Earth in 5 years and destroy everything, or maybe it's going to be 20, or maybe never. You have to do something about the possibility, even small, that this could be catastrophic if you're a public policymaker.
I mean, that's such an interesting framing that a lack of scientific certainty leads to more certainty in the policy response, right? And it shows just how fundamentally different these two practices are, right? And the objectives of different.
Yeah, let me say it in like more like mental images.
Okay.
So when we think about this is we're collectively driving a car and we see the fog in front of us. In other words, we don't know what is behind the fog. And maybe we are in a mountain area. There could be precipices. And some people think, oh, we have reasons to think that there are precipices, that the car could just, we could all die or have, very dangerous accidents. And other people think, no, look, I'm pretty sure that the road is nice and straight. So what should we do? I mean, so the rational thing to do for the people who hold the wheel, which are the governments, is to say, well, let's try to pierce through that fog, like invest massively to make sure we can find technology to pierce through that fog. In other words, understand the risks and potentially mitigate them. And as we approach the places, where some people think there's a precipice, be careful, maybe slow down so that you can do the research to find what's behind the fog. And maybe, advance one little step at a time, making sure you see far enough to not cross into the precipice. That's what we should be doing.
What explains this lack of consensus to you? I mean, it's really remarkable as a citizen, as an engaged citizen watching the scientific community, and to see you and like Yann LeCun on the fundamentally opposite sides of something that as a citizen, I should care a lot about, whether this thing we're building and barreling towards poses an existential threat to humanity. Like, what explains the scale of that divergence of scientific consensus?
So first of all, the scale isn't as large as you think. Let me explain.
Okay.
Yann and I actually agree on many things. Like, the timeline could be anything from a few years to a few decades. Like, if we have AI systems that are smarter than us and we don't know how to control them, it could be catastrophic. So he agrees with these things, even though he wouldn't like say them very loudly. But if you press him, he would agree. The main difference is he thinks that by the time we get there, we'll have figured out how to do it safely, and companies will be sufficiently motivated to like act cautiously and do the right thing just by the forces of market. Whereas I think that it's a chance that we can't take, and we need to make sure society as a whole puts guardrails, because it's well known that companies on their own in the past have been acting in ways that increase their survival probability as a company and their profit at the expense
Mm,
of public safety, public good. We see
mm,
this in climate. We've seen this with tobacco. We've seen this with like early transportation devices, cars and planes that
mm.
were very dangerous initially, until governments came in and put guardrails.
Yeah. So Yann LeCun works for Meta, and to what degree does that positionality affect that view on corporate responsibility? Does he have a better window into it because he's there, or is he influenced by it because he's there?
Well, that's an important question. And of course, we don't know because we can't be in people's minds. But there's, I think, a lot of reasons to think that when you work for a company, you tend to be biased, even unconsciously, in favor of the company's interests.
Mm,
And, this is something well studied by psychologists. It's called motivated cognition. In other words,
mm,
somehow your brain comes up with arguments that happen to be congruent with your interests, or sometimes it's your ego, or sometimes it's, maybe the company you work for. There are all
mm,
kinds of reasons why we might prefer one line of argument to another to protect these interests, but we don't do this consciously. So I'm very convinced that Yann LeCun and others are absolutely sincere.
mm.
It's just that I feel like they have blinders, and that is dangerous for the public good. And
Yeah.
I don't know the statistics, but my guess based on what I see around me is that at least half of the academic, researchers, the professors in AI, have a foot in industry. Their students start a company, they're advising the company, they have shares in those companies, they work
Mm,
part-time for one of the big techs. In fact, it's probably a minority that has no ties to industry. So it's like
mm.
the whole field is highly influenced, maybe, in small ways, maybe in large ways, by that strong footprint of industry on AI, not just in companies, but also in academia.
Yeah. So I'm a professor at McGill, and it is just remarkable how what you said is you see it that every student studying AI is in somehow engaged. Almost every student is somehow engaged with the private sector. And I'm wondering, I mean, that's very different than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you were in computer science departments in Quebec as well. Um, how does put yourself in that mentality of these graduate students? Like, how does that change not just perceptions of risk and potential conflicts of interest, but what core fundamental research is being done and what questions are being asked by the people who are developing the foundational science on which this technology will be based, whatever it is going
Well, a
forward?
simple example is that the vast majority of the research, both in industry and academia, is about how do we make AI more powerful rather than how do we make it
Hmm.
safer.
Hmm.
And the reason is that there's a lot more profit to be gained by making it more powerful.
Hmm.
So there's very, very strong market pressures for companies to focus on being the best at X, some application of AI, which requires more capability. In other words, the machine is reasoning better, coming up with better predictions, better answers. Of course, they also
Hmm.
have a motivation for safety, but it's um, how could I say? There's a word that people like me use now,
Hmm.
safety washing, and you should think of like greenwashing. PR departments of big tech are saying a whole lot of nice things about how they will do the right thing in terms of protecting the public's interest. But when you look at their behavior, when you look at the dozens of people who have left these companies very concerned about the lack of safety in the process, um, and their concerns of retaliation if they were to speak out. So these, I think, should raise red flags, but we're not paying enough attention.
Are companies not costing risk effectively? Even if you're right that like most researchers, even inside these companies, see the possibility of this risk. Like, isn't there scenarios where a catastrophic failure or harm of AI, I mean, that could kill these companies too. I mean, the end of humanity isn't good for corporate interest, is it?
Let me go back to an example people are more familiar with, like climate change. Destruction of the climate isn't good for the CEOs of fossil fuel companies either. But there's so much money to be made in the interim by doing the wrong thing. And there's an economic reason why, your argument doesn't work, which economists call externalities. So what this means is that the cost of something bad happening is borne by everyone in society. And, why would a particular company be the one doing the research to avoid these catastrophes? If they do that, then they're going to lose competition against the other companies, right? Because they're going to spend more of their income on that kind of research. So in other words, the worst student in the class is drawing the whole class down. That's what the race dynamics do. That's why, the only way around from a game theoretical perspective is to create rules that all the players have to follow. And it's the same thing in other industries. In pharma, the cost of safety, like all the tests they do to make sure the drugs are not going to harm people, is way above the cost of actually discovering the drugs in the first place.
So in democratic societies, we entrust governments to look to those to incorporate those externalities more broadly than corporate interests and to protect public and collective goods. But in some ways, it feels like governments are fueling this growth as well because they see real economic benefit. They're all competing for the same investment. They're looking for breakthroughs like the one you made. In Canada, the Canadian government wants the next Yoshua Bengio to be here. Are they fueling this as well? And do they need to check some of their enthusiasm and the gas they're putting into this ecosystem?
Yes. They also biased and have issues of motivated cognition because they have multiple responsibilities, often sitting in different departments of governments. So one responsibility is to economic growth. And another responsibility is to protecting the public. And of course, these come into conflict.